Bavaria, 1896. A village wrapped in the folds of mist, its rooftops dark with soot, its fields exhausted from harvest, and in the distance, a monastery whose silhouette was etched into the sky like an iron cross against pale clouds. This was not a time of peace. It was a time when hunger gnawed at families, when faith was the only currency against despair, and when silence weighed heavier than truth. And yet, in that silence, something uncanny had taken root, roses blooming where no life should have survived. The first account comes not from a priest or a magistrate, but from a farmer's daughter named Clara, who was 12 when she saw them. She recalled years later in a wavering, a script that the soil by the monastery wall was black as coal, scorched as though by a great fire. The grass there had never grown back. Villagers said it was cursed. But in the summer of that year, after an unrecorded night of smoke and silence, roses appeared. Not wild roses, not straggling weeds. Perfect, blood-red blossoms rising in clusters on stems, as if nourished by some hidden spring. For a community that measured hope in rosaries and ration sacks, the roses were a marvel. The nuns claimed it was a blessing. The villagers crossed themselves, and the abbot declared it a sign of sanctification. But children whispered, otherwise, that they had seen sparks on the night before, that they had smelled burning flesh in the wind. No one dared speak too loudly. The parish was not a place for questions. Imagine for a moment the scene as it must have been. Smoke clinging low to the earth, the silence of bells that should have rung in the night and in the morning. Petals redder than blood, glistening with dew, beauty standing upright on soil that stank faintly of ash. It is this contrast between miracle and menace that first drew investigators decades later, and it is why the case still unsettles those who read the few surviving documents. To begin this story is to acknowledge its dual nature, the roses that inspired hymns and the ashes that demanded inquiry. What was offered as proof of divine favor may instead have been the evidence of a crime hidden beneath a veil of holiness, and the silence that followed, the collective choice to accept roses over truth, would define the parish for generations. This is not folklore. The records, though scarce, point to incidents that can be traced, names that can be recovered, and artifacts that resist the comfort of denial. The monastery that grew roses on ashes is not only a place on a map, but also a symbol of what a community will choose to remember and what it will choose to bury. Before we move further into this account, there is a responsibility to pause. Stories that tread on the boundary between history and horror can wound. As much as they inform, what follows is drawn from archived fragments, testimonies recorded decades after the events, and institutional documents only reluctantly unsealed. It touches on themes of death, exploitation, and the silence of those who held power. None of what you will hear is meant to sensationalize. It is told with care for those who lived, and with respect for those whose voices were never preserved. Consider this a warning and an invitation. If the idea of children harmed within sacred walls, or faith twisted into a shield for cruelty, sits too heavily on you, you may wish to step away now. But if you remain, let it be with awareness. The line between reverence and silence can be perilous, and in this case, silence cost lives. Our telling will not linger on the gruesome or the lurid. Instead, it will remain fixed on the choices made, the concealments, the artifacts, the contradictions between what was said from the pulpit and what was buried in the soil. Why revisit such darkness? Because silence is not only a past condition, it is a present temptation. The parish of that Bavarian valley chose roses over ash, devotion over confrontation. But ask yourself, in your own community, in your own family, what truths have been set aside because they were too heavy to carry into the open? The monastery's story is not only about monks and villagers in 1896, it is about the universal, human struggle between facing what is unbearable and choosing instead to sanctify the unbearable with flowers. As you listen, we ask something small of you. Let us know where you are listening from. Communities across the world tune into accounts like these, and in that sharing, the weight of silence is broken. In a way, every comment, every acknowledgement becomes a counterpoint to the hush that smothered this village for over a century. This is not a ghost story, though ghosts will linger here. It is not a miracle tale, though miracles were claimed. It is the slow, methodical reconstruction of what happened when faith was used as a mask, when beauty was made to grow from ruin, and when ordinary people decided it was easier to bow their heads than to raise their voices. And so, with this understanding, we step inside the gates of the parish, into the ordered cloisters of its monastery, and into the silence that once seemed unbreakable. The valley that cradled the monastery was a quiet place, hemmed in by low Bavarian hills, its soil poor but serviceable, its villages huddled in tight clusters of timber and stone. Life there was a rhythm of hunger and harvest, of mass in the morning and toil in the fields until dusk. Families survived on rye bread, potatoes, and the occasional goat's milk, their bellies never quite full, their children thin-armed and wide-eyed. Yet for all its hardship, the parish was held together by its faith. The church tower was not only the highest point on the horizon, it was the axis on which the people's lives turned. The monastery sat apart, a structure of grey stone whose walls were said to date back to the 12th century. To the villagers it seemed eternal, as if it had always been there and always would be. The abbot and his brothers in habit commanded reverence as naturally as they commanded silence. To enter those gates was to step into another world, one ruled not by the hunger of the earth, but by the dictates of heaven, at least as spoken through the monks. Children sent as novices often did not return home except on rare feast days, and parents accepted this as both honor and sacrifice. Social order was rigid. The villagers lived at the mercy of weather, landlords, and the monastery's influence. Disputes were settled less by law than by confessional absolution. To question a priest was to risk being marked as faithless. To challenge an abbot was to invite suspicion of heresy. Yet beneath this piety lay quiet resentments. The villagers saw the monastery's stores of grain when they themselves starved. They smelled wine from its cellars, while their own wells froze in winter. They brought offerings for blessings, and left knowing that some invisible ledger measured their worth. Geographically, the parish seemed isolated, but roads did run east toward Munich, carrying news of industry, revolutions past, and scientific inquiry that promised to unseat old certainties. Still, the valley clung to its ways, holding fast to a world where the church was the one fixed point in a landscape of uncertainty. When rumors of strange practices began to surface, when the first whispers of ash and roses reached the ears of farmers, the geography itself conspired to trap the truth. The hills kept sound from traveling. The walls kept questions from being asked too loudly. The moral stakes were set long before the incidents that would follow. The people had to choose daily between survival and resistance, between reverence and doubt. To speak against the monastery was to risk exclusion from sacraments, to risk the eternal condemnation they had been taught to fear more than hunger. In this crucible, silence was not just complicity, it was a means of staying alive. And yet silence allowed what came next: disappearances, inexplicable roses, and the unanswerable question of what the brothers in stone truly served. It began quietly, in a way that allowed people to look away. One evening in late autumn, the choir's voices lifted through the stone nave of the monastery, thin but steady, echoing off vaulted ceilings blackened with centuries of smoke from candles. Among the boys was one named Jakob, scarcely 12, whose clear treble had carried the psalms with an innocence that softened even the hardest hearts in the parish pews. He was the son of a cooper, given to the monastery 2 years earlier, with the hope that he might rise in learning, perhaps even to priesthood. To his family, Jakob's place among the choir was both pride and a form of surrender. That evening was the last time his voice was heard. By dawn, when villagers arrived for early prayers, Jakob's place in the row of novices stood empty. The monks told the gathered faithful that the boy had taken ill suddenly, that he was being cared for within the infirmary, and that prayers should be offered for his swift recovery. Few dared to question this, for illness was common, and children did sometimes vanish into fever. But there were details that gnawed at those who paid attention. No physician had been summoned. No candles were lit at the altar for his healing. And when his parents requested to see their son, the abbot assured them that visitation would only worsen his condition. For days afterward, whispers moved quietly between cottages. Jakob's younger sister told her friends that she had seen her father return from the monastery with eyes red from weeping. A farmhand claimed he had glimpsed smoke rising from behind the cloister walls that same night, thicker than the usual kitchen fire. A milkmaid swore she had heard bells toll once at midnight, though no festival or vigil had been declared. None of these fragments were spoken aloud in the churchyard, for to do so was to invite rebuke. The parish was caught between two forces. On one hand, the natural grief of a family deprived of their son. On the other, the towering authority of men sworn to God. The villagers told themselves the Isabidio monastery knew best, that perhaps the boy had been sent away for treatment, that perhaps some holy discipline required silence. They wanted to believe the explanations, because disbelief was dangerous. Yet in the privacy of journals that would surface only years later, unease was recorded. One villager, a widow named Marta, wrote in her plain script, "The boy Jacob is gone. The monks say sick, but there was no doctor. I fear not illness, but something darker. The roses bloom now in strange places. The bells sound when no hands are near." Still, publicly, the parish remained hushed. Jacob's name was mentioned only in muted tones, then less and less until it was spoken no more. His absence was absorbed into the larger silence that cloaked the monastery. It was the first disappearance, but not the last, and it marked the moment when faith began to blur with fear. The garden lay on the monastery's southern edge, pressed against the wall where the stone caught the longest hours of sunlight. For as long as the villagers could remember, that strip of land had been barren. Dow fire decades earlier had scorched it to black, and not even weeds had managed to return. Crows avoided it. Children who strayed too close claimed the ground smelled faintly, of smoke even in summer, and the old swore the place was cursed. Yet in the spring following Jacob's disappearance, something stirred in that soil that none could ignore. It began with a single bloom, one rose, improbably red, unfurling from charred earth. It appeared after a night of storms when lightning had struck the ridge above the village. At dawn, a shepherd boy found it glistening with dew, so vivid against the black soil that he believed it must be an apparition. Within a week there were a dozen. Within a month, the barren strip was crowded with blossoms, all crimson, all unnaturally perfect. Their fragrance clung heavy in the air, sweet and metallic, unlike any rose grown in the valley. The parish women were the first to call it a miracle. They gathered petals to dry for sachets, convinced the roses carried healing power. Mothers pressed them into prayer books. The abbot declared from the pulpit that the garden was proof of divine favor, a blessing upon a parish faithful even in hardship. The monks began to harvest the blooms and weave them into crowns for holy festivals. The story of the roses spread quickly, drawing pilgrims from neighboring villages eager to see the miracle soil. But beneath the marvel lay unease. The farmer's daughter Clara, who had first described the blossoms, confided years later that the scent troubled her. It reminded her of blood and smoke. Others noticed the roses bloomed most fiercely after nights when strange fires glowed faintly within the cloister walls. Some whispered that the soil had been enriched with ashes, not from wood, but from flesh. The more devout silenced such talk, insisting that suspicion was blasphemy. Yet the thought lingered, like the fragrance that clung stubbornly to one's clothes after visiting the garden. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, the villagers starving, their fields barely offering barley and potatoes. On the other, roses sprouting in impossible abundance from cursed ground. Beauty and abundance set against hunger and ash. The parishioners clutched the blooms with trembling hands, unwilling or perhaps unable to ask what nourished them. One pilgrim, writing in a journal preserved in a family chest, recorded, "The garden is lovely beyond description, but I feel no peace there. The monks say it is heaven's gift. My heart whispers otherwise. Such artifacts, though sparse, capture the tension of the moment, the desire to believe in miracle, and the nagging dread that something darker had taken root beneath the petals." The roses became the parish's pride, a shield against outside scrutiny. For if the monastery could grow such beauty from scorched ground, who among the villagers dared to question what else it might be hiding? The bells of the monastery had always been the valley's heartbeat. They tolled for morning prayers, for the Angelus at noon, for Vespers at dusk. They rang in storms. They rang for feast days. They rang for funerals. Even those who resented the monastery's power admitted the bells were a comfort, steady and sure, guiding the rhythm of their days. And then, without warning, they fell silent. It happened first on a Sunday, when the villagers gathered in the chill of dawn, expecting to hear the call to worship. The air was still, the mist heavy, yet no sound carried across the fields. Confused, some assumed the monks had delayed, but the hour passed, then another, until a brother came to the square and declared that the bell mechanism had broken in the night, a simple explanation given with calm authority. Yet the villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Those bells had swung faithfully for centuries, their ropes thick and tended with care. For them to fail suddenly seemed unlikely. In the days that followed, the silence grew heavier. People marked time by the sun, rather than the familiar peal. Livestock stirred uneasily, dogs barked at nothing, and the rhythm of village life felt disjointed, unmoored. Then came the reports, whispered first among children, and then nervously by their elders, that the bells had not been silent at all. Several villagers swore they had heard them toll at midnight, long after the official explanation of a broken mechanism. One widow martyr wrote in her diary, "I heard the bells tonight." No hands pulled them, for no feast was set. They tolled low, and each stroke chilled me. The monks denied this flatly. They insisted the bells could not have sounded. Yet villagers began to recount strange details. A shepherd claimed he saw the rope sway, though no man stood near. A young mother said her infant woke, screaming at the exact hour the bells supposedly rang. And always, after these nights, the roses seemed thicker, their scent more pungent, as if answering a summons none dared name. The contrast grew unbearable. The bells, once symbols of reassurance, became harbingers of dread. What should have marked the hours of prayer now marked unspoken fears. Faith and terror stood side by side in the same sound. Some villagers avoided the church altogether, whispering that to step beneath the silent tower was to invite misfortune. Others clung tighter to ritual, desperate to drown doubt with devotion. This was no longer an isolated unease, but a pattern. First a boy vanished, then roses bloomed from cursed ground. Now the bells, the voice of the parish itself, had turned from comfort to omen. Though no accusations were spoken aloud, the silence between neighbors thickened. Questions rose, but they were locked, behind lips trained by generations never to challenge sacred authority. And so the monastery's shadow grew longer. The incidents could no longer be brushed aside as misfortune or miracle. They formed a chain, tightening around the valley, each link a reminder that something within the cloistered walls was reshaping faith into fear. The arrival of Dr. Lucas Bauer marked the first breach in the parish's silence. He came not as a pilgrim, nor as a man of faith, but as an alienist, trained in the emerging sciences of the mind, dispatched from Munich at the behest of distant officials who had begun to take notice of the troubling reports filtering out of the valley. His journey was long, the roads muddy with late spring rain, his carriage wheels sticking in the ruts. By the time he reached the village, his coat was dusted white with travel, and his eyes carried the weight of skepticism. Bauer was a man shaped by two worlds. Born the son of a bookseller, he had trained in both medicine and philosophy, drawn into the study of human behavior at a time when Europe was torn between faith and the rise of rational inquiry. His colleagues in Munich whispered of hysteria, mesmerism, and the unconscious. Bauer, however, sought patterns in fear and silence, believing communities revealed their wounds, not in speech but in what they refused to say. The valley, with its vanished novice, its roses on cursed earth, and its midnight bells, seemed to him a place where silence itself had become a kind of illness. His arrival unsettled the villagers. To them he was a stranger, a man of the city whose trimmed beard and dark spectacles gave him an air of detachment. They greeted him with guarded courtesy, but offered little information. When he asked about Jakob, eyes dropped to the ground. When he mentioned the roses, shoulders stiffened. A farmer muttered that outsiders could not understand God's mysteries. A shopkeeper crossed himself and changed the subject. It was as if the whole parish had been trained to speak around the truth, leaving gaps for Bauer to puzzle over. The monastery greeted him with rehearsed solemnity. The abbot, a tall man with a voice polished by years of sermons, welcomed him into the cloister with words of piety. He explained that the bells had indeed broken and were under repair. that the roses were blessings from the Virgin, and that the boy Jacob had been sent away quietly for health's sake. Every answer was plausible, yet each carried the sheen of performance, as though carefully memorized. Bauer, skilled in observing gesture and tone, noted the flicker in the eyes of the younger monks, the hesitations before certain words, the faint smell of smoke clinging to the cloister stones. He began his investigation in the way he knew best, through quiet observation and recorded notes. Each evening in his rented room above the tavern, he filled page after page in his journal. He noted the rhythms of the villagers' movements, the hushed exchanges in the market, the way children lingered at the edge of the monastery's walls but never crossed the threshold. He recorded the bells, silence by day, and the reports of their phantom tolls by night. He wrote, "This is no mere superstition. The silence is cultivated, enforced as a crop is sown, harvested in fear." The contrast between him and the parish was stark. Bauer carried the tools of rational inquiry, ink, reason, discipline, while the valley carried centuries of deference and dread. His presence forced the villagers to confront a question they had long avoided. Was their faith shielding them from sin or binding them to it? The abbot, though outwardly gracious, saw in Bauer a threat, not merely to the monastery's order, but to the structure of authority that bound the parish to obedience. And so, beneath the veneer of civility, a conflict began to take shape. Science against sanctity, inquiry against secrecy, one man's pen against centuries of silence. Bauer did not yet know the dangers awaiting him, but his arrival had already disturbed the balance. The parish's silence had been pierced, and the monastery's shadow stirred uneasily. The ledger was not meant to be found. It lay buried in the monastery's library, where shelves of cracked leather bindings and worm-eaten parchment seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. The brothers prided themselves on their archives, but what they displayed was carefully curated: sermons, liturgies, histories of saints. Bauer suspected, as any investigator would, that true records often hid where no one thought to look. He spent days walking the cloisters under the guise of scholarly interest, asking to see catalogues of parish deaths and inventories of the monastery's holdings. His requests were politely deflected, redirected to registers that seemed too pristine, too complete. It was a young monk, nervous in Bauer's presence, who made the mistake that opened a crack. While retrieving a hymn book from a lower shelf, he exposed a gap where the dust was disturbed. Bauer's eyes, trained to notice what others overlooked, fixed upon it. Later, when left alone for a brief moment, he pressed the shelf and found that behind the row of psalters was a narrow alcove, just wide enough to conceal a slim ledger bound in plain calfskin. Unlike the other books, its cover bore no title, only a faint discoloration from handling. When he opened it that evening in his room above the tavern, his pulse quickened. The pages were filled with lists written in a hurried hand, dated in uneven intervals. Most entries were sparse, little more than a name or sometimes merely an initial, followed by notations like delivered, processed, or laid to rest. What struck Bauer immediately was their absence from the official parish registry. He had already examined those public documents, which recorded baptisms, marriages, and burials with bureaucratic neatness. The names in the hidden ledger appeared nowhere else. He traced the earliest entries back nearly a decade. At first they came one or two at a time, scattered months apart. But in the past 2 years, the very years when rumors of roses and bells had begun, the frequency quickened. Dozens of names crowded the lines, each marked with the same terse word, delivered. Bauer noted that many were children, their ages indicated by single digits in the margins. One entry read simply, J12 delivered. He copied the most telling excerpts into his own journal, fearing the ledger might be taken if discovered. He wrote, "This document does not belong to the order of the parish. It belongs to secrecy. These are records of the disappeared, kept apart from the community's memory, concealed like rot behind stone." The contrast was devastating. The public face of the monastery was one of order, of meticulous accounts and righteous transparency. The hidden ledger revealed another world, one where names were reduced to initials, where the dead or disappeared were stripped even of acknowledgement in the parish book. erasure beside remembrance, ashes beside roses. Bauer confronted a monk indirectly the next day, inquiring whether the monastery kept any private lists of those buried within its walls. The monk's hands trembled as he adjusted his robe, murmuring that such matters were for the abbot's eyes alone. That tremor told Bauer more than words ever could. With the ledger, Bauer held his first tangible proof that something was concealed behind the monastery's silence. Yet he also knew the danger. To reveal it prematurely could mean its destruction, or worse, his expulsion from the valley. For now he would keep it close, let its weight guide his next steps, and wait for another crack to open in the wall of secrecy. By the time Bauer had been in the valley a fortnight, the mood of the parish had shifted in a way he could almost measure in the air. Conversations in the market grew sharper, glances more suspicious, and neighbors who had once prayed side by side now lingered apart. It was not his presence alone that unsettled them. It was what his presence suggested. Questions, long buried, were being stirred up, and silence, once a shield, was beginning to crack. The roses, ironically, stood at the center of the rift. To some, they were the purest sign of God's favor, proof that the monastery was blessed above all. Pilgrims brought offerings of coins and candles to the garden, kneeling to gather fallen petals as relics. Women whispered of cures for ailments. Children were brought to touch the blossoms in hopes of health. The abbot encouraged this devotion, declaring during Mass that the roses grew from the prayers of the faithful, watered by sacrifice. The words hung heavy, their meaning ambiguous, but none dared challenge him aloud. Others, however, began to voice doubts in private. Farmers muttered that the roses thrived too suddenly, too violently, as if nourished by something unnatural. The widow Marta, whose diary had already noted the phantom bells, confided to a friend that she smelled burning whenever the roses thickened after a storm. The memory of Jacob's disappearance lingered like a bruise, and though no one spoke his name in church, his absence was felt in every hymn. The division was not clean. Families themselves were torn. A husband might cling to the abbot's word, desperate for assurance that the world was not collapsing into blasphemy, while his wife quietly confessed suspicion to her sister. Brothers quarreled. Fathers and sons exchanged heated words, all careful never to let these disputes reach the ears of the clergy. The contrast became unmistakable: public piety, private fracture. In the pews, faces were serene, heads bowed. In kitchens and barns, voices rose in anger or dropped to fearful whispers. Bauer felt this tension pressing upon him as he moved through the village. Children followed him at a distance, curious but wary, while adults either avoided his gaze or clutched his sleeve to whisper, hurried. Fragments, always at dusk, always with a glance over the shoulder. One farmer confessed that he had seen monks digging at night near the rose garden, though he dared not approach. Another admitted hearing screams muffled by stone. Yet when Bauer pressed them for detail, fear silenced their tongues. "Do not write my name," they pleaded. It was as though the parish itself had split into two realities. In one, a miracle garden drew worshippers, sanctified by the abbot's words. In the other, dread and suspicion gnawed quietly, eroding trust. The villagers could no longer ignore that something was wrong, but neither could they bring themselves to speak it openly. They lived in a fragile equilibrium of faith and fear, each side feeding the other. Bauer recorded in his journal, "The roses are a wedge dividing the people. Their beauty sanctifies silence. Their perfume masks the stench of ash. It is a strange kind of devotion, to celebrate what one secretly dreads." The valley was holding its breath, caught between miracle and menace. And though the villagers did not yet know it, the weight of that silence was about to break. For Bauer had found more than whispers. He had begun to uncover written proof that the monastery's garden grew not from prayer, but from something far darker. The discovery of the coded letters came almost by accident, though Bauer would later admit he had been searching for something of the sort all along. He had learned through careful listening that the abbot maintained correspondence not only with the bishopric in Regensburg, but with other monasteries scattered across Bavaria. Most of these letters were ordinary enough: requests for supplies, accounts of tithes, notices of feast days. Yet Bauer suspected as he sifted through bundles of parchment and folded sheets offered reluctantly by the monastery's archivist, that not every letter found its way into the official files. The clue came in the form of a loose sheaf, tucked inside a hymnal used by the novices. The parchment was newer than the hymnal itself, its edges unyellowed, the ink a deep brown that had not yet faded. The script was peculiar, flowing Latin phrases that seemed polished at first glance, but on closer inspection bore irregularities, words oddly shortened, punctuation placed where it served no grammatical purpose. Bauer had studied ciphers in Munich, fascinated by the way hidden messages could lurk inside prayers and poems. His instinct told him at once that these were not simple mistakes. Over several nights in his tavern room, he worked methodically to decipher the pattern. At first, he believed it to be a substitution code, but gradually he saw that every third word, when strung together, formed a new sentence, skeletal but coherent. The hidden lines chilled him. Experiment complete. Ashes rendered. Roses abundant. Purity achieved. Bauer grew more cautious, copying the words into his private journal with a hand that trembled. Despite his discipline, each fragment suggested that the roses were not heaven's blessing, but the result of deliberate trials. The language was both clinical and devotional. Phrases like the purification of the vessel and sanctity through combustion were paired with meticulous references to timing and soil. He understood then that the abbot and his circle were not merely concealing disappearances. They were conducting something that straddled the line between ritual and science, between liturgy and laboratory. A second letter, cracked by the same method, referred to deliveries secured, ages appropriate, the garden flourishes. The implication struck him like a blow. The missing children, the initials in the hidden ledger, were not accidents of illness or runaway novices. They were deliveries absorbed into a process masked as holy work. The contrast could not have been sharper. To the villagers, the letter's surface text, psalms and devotions, reinforced piety. To Bauer, the hidden layer revealed a machinery of cruelty dressed in sanctity. Faith became a cipher itself, its outer beauty disguising inner corruption. When he confronted one of the younger monks indirectly, quoting a fragment of the hidden message, the man's face went white, his lips forming the sign of the cross with shaking fingers. He muttered that such words were not for laymen to know, that the abbot guarded mysteries too sacred for common eyes. His denial was fervent, but his terror was unmistakable. Bauer recorded in his journal that night, "These are not miracles but procedures. The abbot has married science to superstition, and the parish kneels to the results. The roses are not gifts of heaven. They are trophies of a crime." The coded letters became Bauer's most dangerous possession. Proof undeniable, yet proof that could condemn him as quickly as it condemned the monastery. If the abbot learned they had been uncovered, Bauer knew his investigation would not end in mere expulsion. For in exposing the roses, he was threatening not only the monastery's authority but the faith that cloaked it. Bauer chose his moment carefully. He knew that confronting the abbot openly in front of the brothers would be reckless. The man's authority was absolute within the cloister, and even a whisper of heresy could turn the parish against him. Instead, he requested a private audience under the pretense of scholarly inquiry. The abbot agreed, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of curiosity, and led Bauer into his chamber, a stone room furnished sparsely but with unmistakable weight, a crucifix carved in dark oak, shelves of theological texts, and a heavy desk scarred by years of use. The air was close, heavy with incense, though no censer burned. Bauer laid the ledger and the copied fragments of coded letters upon the desk, his hands steady though his heart raced. "These," he said evenly, "do not match the official records, nor the teachings of the church." For a moment the abbot studied the documents in silence, his face unreadable. Then, instead of denial, he offered a thin smile. "You are a man of science, Doctor. Surely you, above all, understand that truth is never so simple as the villagers believe." His voice was calm, almost paternal, yet beneath it ran a current of iron. Bauer pressed. He spoke of Jacob, of the initials in the ledger, of the roses that bloomed too perfectly to be natural. He read aloud one of the deciphered lines, "Purity achieved through combustion." His voice caught slightly on the word, but he did not falter. "This is no miracle," he said. "It is desecration." The abbot's composure did not crack, but his eyes sharpened. "Desecration?" he repeated softly. "You mistake sanctity for sin. What you call desecration, I call offering. We return what is flawed to ash, and from that ash God grants beauty. Would you call the rose sinful, Doctor? Would you deny its fragrance? Its perfection?" The exchange crystallized the contrast Bauer had sensed from the beginning. Deference versus defiance. Faith cloaked as justification against reason, wielded as accusation. Bauer refused to bow, his words cutting through the chamber's incense-thick air. "God requires no child suffering to prove his glory." The abbot's reply was chilling in its serenity. "And yet the people believe. They bring their children to touch the roses. They pray more fervently now than they did in years of famine. Their faith is stronger, their devotion deeper. If sacrifice breeds such fruit, is it not holy?" Bauer felt the full weight of the trap. The abbot was not merely concealing crimes. He had fashioned them into theology, embedding them so deeply into the parish's faith that to expose him would be to rip open the very fabric of belief. The villagers, desperate for beauty in a life of want, might defend him rather than condemn him. Still, Bauer did not relent. "Your holiness does not excuse ledger entries written in secret," he said, his voice low. "Nor does it excuse children who vanish without burial rites." He gathered the documents back into his satchel, knowing he would not sway the abbot with reason alone. The man's faith or his ambition was unshakable. The abbot leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Doctor, you should be careful. Inquiry can be dangerous in places where faith runs deeper than blood. The parish thrives on silence. Break it, and you may find yourself among the ashes you so fear." When Bauer stepped out of the chamber, the cloister felt colder, the shadows longer. He had confronted authority and received not denial but conviction. Otherwise a conviction so absolute, it was more frightening than any lie. He knew then that the struggle ahead would not be won with words alone. The night raid was not Bauer's idea alone, though his evidence was the spark that ignited it. A small circle of villagers, already restless with fear and suspicion, gathered in the tavern after dark. Among them were two fathers whose children had vanished over the past year, a mason who claimed to have seen monks digging at midnight, and Marta the widow, her eyes sunken but unblinking. They spoke in low voices, their words edged with anger that had grown too sharp for silence. Bauer unwrapped his journal, spreading the copied fragments of letters across the table. By the flicker of a single candle he read them aloud. Each phrase, ashes rendered, purity achieved, deliveries secured, hung in the stale air like smoke. The decision was made without ceremony. They would enter the monastery under cover of darkness, while the bells marked matins. The brothers would be in the chapel then, their chants echoing against stone, leaving the cloister vulnerable. The villagers were not soldiers, but desperation armed them. Axes meant for woodcutting, torches wrapped in tar, and Bauer's satchel of papers as both shield and compass. As they crossed the frost-stiffened fields, the contrast of their purpose gnawed at Bauer. Here were men and women who had once knelt for blessings at the monastery door, now approaching it like trespassers, ready to uncover what their own faith had hidden from them. The cloister walls, silvered by moonlight, loomed like the ramparts of a fortress. Yet the singing inside was serene, haunting in its devotion. Sanctuary versus secrecy, piety against the possibility of horror. They slipped through a side gate left unlatched, its hinges groaning faintly. The garden of roses lay before them, dark mounds of foliage whispering in the wind. Even in shadow, the blossoms glowed faintly, their scent unnaturally strong. Bauer paused, catching what he thought was the acrid tang of charred wood beneath the perfume. One of the fathers muttered a prayer under his breath, torn between reverence and dread. It was Marta who found the hidden door. Near the edge of the rosebeds, half concealed by ivy, a stone slab bore scrape marks along its base. With effort they pried it open, revealing a stairwell that descended into darkness. Cold air rushed upward, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of ash and damp stone. Bauer lit a lantern, its glow trembling over the steps, and together they descended. The chamber beneath was no crypt for saints. It was a vault of records and remnants, arranged with meticulous care. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with ledgers, folded notes, and glass jars that held residues of ash. In the center stood a brazier, its embers long cooled, but the blackened floor around it spoke of frequent use. Beside it lay bundles of cloth, too small, too delicate to have belonged to grown men. One bore the embroidered edge of a child's nightshirt. Bauer's lantern quivered in his hand as he opened a ledger. Names filled the pages, each paired with a date, each followed by a Latin phrase, consumptus purificatus, oblatus, consumed, purified, offered. The men behind him cursed softly, one pressing his fist to his mouth as if to stifle a cry. Marta stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the brazier as though staring into the memory of every rumor she had ever whispered. The silence of discovery was broken by the faint echo of chanting above. The monks still lost in their liturgy. It was a sound that now twisted against itself, hymns to God layered over evidence of human sacrifice. Bauer wrote in his journal later, "Faith and fire sing in the same breath here. The brothers call it sanctity. The ash calls it something else entirely." They gathered what they could carry, letters, fragments of garments, a jar of ash sealed with wax. Every item was both proof and accusation, yet each weighed on them as though it carried the cries of the vanished. As they prepared to leave, one of the men whispered that this chamber was only the beginning, that the monastery's foundations might hold deeper secrets still. When they emerged into the cold air of the garden, the roses swayed as if disturbed by more than the wind. The villagers hurried back through the gate, their torches now guttering, their faces pale. Behind them the chanting rose higher, pure and unwavering, as though the monks sang not in ignorance but in defiance of what had just been uncovered. Bauer knew the raid had opened a door that could never again be closed. Proof was no longer hidden in shadows. It was carried now in their hands, in their hearts, and in their silence turned to fury. The confrontation to come would not be one of whispers and secret codes, but of faith against truth, authority against conscience. By morning, word of the raid had spread faster than Bauer could have imagined. Though only a handful had descended into the monastery's vault, the details leapt from mouth to mouth like sparks in dry grass. Some swore they had seen jars of human ash carried back to the tavern. Others whispered of bones unearthed beneath the roses. The truth, already dreadful enough, was embroidered with rumor, until no one could say where. Discovery ended and invention began. Yet beneath every exaggeration lay the same immovable fact. The silence of the parish had been broken. The villagers gathered in clusters, voices sharp and urgent. In the square, an old man shouted that Bauer was a heretic, stirring rebellion against holy men, while a mother wailed that her missing child's name had been found in a ledger. The blacksmith cursed the abbot aloud, hammering his anvil with such violence that sparks flew, while the baker crossed herself and warned that blasphemy would invite plague. Each voice clashed against another. Belief against suspicion, trust against despair. The abbot responded swiftly. At the morning mass, his voice filled the chapel with practiced calm. He acknowledged that trespassers had broken into a private chamber of the monastery, desecrating sacred spaces. He insisted the ledgers were misunderstood, records of donations and prayers, not of lives lost. The jars of ash, he said, were relics of martyrs preserved in reverence, not evidence of unspeakable deeds. His explanation was elegant, delivered with the authority of one who had guided the parish through famine and pestilence. Many nodded, clinging to his words as to a raft in storm. Yet others were not convinced. Bauer stood silently at the back of the chapel, the jar of ash hidden in his satchel, listening as the congregation fractured before his eyes. One father shouted from the pews, demanding to see his son's name in the ledger. Two monks moved to restrain him, and the scuffle left the congregation rattled. The widow Marta, her face pale but resolute, cried out that the abbot had lied, that she had seen with her own eyes the chamber of offerings. Her voice quivered, yet it carried with the strength of a lifetime of suppressed grief. The contrast in the room was unbearable. Hymns against accusations, incense against the memory of burning flesh. Faith's sweetness collided with the acrid taste of doubt. Some villagers left in tears, unwilling to hear more, while others lingered in tight knots, their faces grim. For the first time in years, the abbot's words did not dissolve dissent. Instead, they hardened it. Bauer returned to his quarters and wrote feverishly, "The parish stands upon a fissure. On one side, devotion blinded by beauty, on the other, rage sharpened by loss. Neither can yet swallow the other, but both are growing. The roses have divided the people as surely as the chamber divided the earth. What blooms above is fragile. What lies beneath festers." That evening, torches burned in the square, not for prayer but for debate. Voices rose until they shook the windows of the tavern. Bauer stood apart, watching the parish tear at itself. A woman clutched his sleeve and begged him to leave before he was killed. Another pressed a folded scrap of paper into his hand. A note scrawled in haste, "There is another chamber, deeper." The aftermath of the raid was not resolution but escalation. Silence had been broken, but in its place came something more volatile, a parish forced to choose between its shepherd and its own eyes, between the fragrance of roses and the stench of ash. Bauer knew the days ahead would not be governed by reasoned inquiry. They would be governed by passion, fear, and the raw force of belief. The anonymous note weighed heavily in Bauer's pocket. It scrawled stark against the coarse paper. He read it again and again by the dim light of his lantern. There is another chamber, deeper. The implication was clear. What they had found beneath the roses, dreadful as it was not the heart of the secret. The vault of ashes and ledgers was merely an antechamber, a surface layer of concealment. Beneath it, perhaps, lay the true foundation of the monastery's miracle. Yet to pursue it meant more than academic curiosity. The parish was in uproar. The abbot had tightened his hold on the brothers, and Bauer's own face had become a dividing line in the village. Children were warned not to speak to him, and men argued openly about whether he should be driven from the valley. Still, the promise of deeper truth gnawed at him, an itch no warning could soothe. To walk away now would be to abandon the missing, to let the roses continue to bloom on unmarked graves. He returned to the monastery under pretense of seeking reconciliation, carrying with him the satchel of papers and the ash-filled jar. The abbot received him coolly, the memory of their last exchange still sharp between them. Bauer did not challenge him directly this time. Instead, he asked to study the architecture of the cloister, invoking his training in antiquities. "There are foundations here older than your order," he said softly. "Roman stone beneath Gothic arches. To understand faith, one must understand its roots." The abbot regarded him for a long moment before permitting him access to the lower halls, though under the watch of a novice. It was in these shadowed passages that Bauer searched for signs of hidden structure. The air grew damper, the stones rougher, until he found what he sought, a section of wall where the mortar was newer, less weathered than the stones surrounding it. He pressed his palm against it and felt a faint current of air, as though the wall concealed more than rock. The novice, uneasy, muttered a prayer and urged him to turn back. Bauer noted the place in his journal and returned to the village under the cover of nightfall. He confided in Marta and the two grieving fathers, showing them the note. Their faces hardened with resolve. "If there is another chamber," one said, "we must see it. We cannot live with half a truth." The widow only nodded, her eyes burning with quiet fury. Plans were made for another incursion, but this time with greater risk, for the monastery was no longer unsuspecting. Guards moved through the cloister at night, and the brothers carried torches more often than before. Bauer's own thoughts shifted between dread and compulsion. The contrast was unbearable. Above ground, the monastery stood serene, its bells marking holy hours, its garden fragrant with roses. Below ground, there were whispers of chambers sealed with ash and cloth, perhaps bones. He wrote, "Faith is an edifice of stone and chant. Beneath it, silence groans in hollow vaults. To descend is to choose truth over sanctuary, light over perfume." On the eve of their attempt, Bauer slept little. He dreamt of roses that bled soot when plucked, of a church whose foundations crumbled to reveal endless stairwells, descending into fire. He awoke with the taste of smoke on his tongue and the conviction that the note was no mere warning, it was a summons. The following night, under a moon smothered by clouds, Bauer and his small company crept once more toward the monastery. Each step seemed heavier than the last, for they were not simply trespassing now. They were defying a man who had already warned. Bauer, what fate awaited those who disturbed the silence? Their torches remained unlit until the gate closed behind them, and the garden's perfume seemed to mock their resolve. At the wall where Bauer had marked the fresh mortar, they set their tools to stone. The first strike rang too loudly, echoing down the passage like a bell. They froze, listening for footsteps, but none came. Another strike, then another, until the mortar cracked and dust plumed into the air. Behind the wall, a blackness deeper than night gaped open, and with it came a draught of air colder than any Bauer had ever felt in his lungs. It smelled of damp earth, iron, and something acrid he dared not name. He raised his lantern, its flame wavering, and the beam caught the edge of a stair spiraling downward. The abbot's warning echoed in his mind. Inquiry can be dangerous, but the note had already led them here, and now there was no retreat. The first step into the hidden stairwell was like crossing a threshold between worlds. Above, faintly, the monastery still breathed with chants and candlelight. Below, the air grew colder with every descent, carrying a metallic tang that clung to the tongue. Bauer's lantern cast a narrow circle of gold upon rough-hewn stone, and behind him the footsteps of the grieving fathers and martyr echoed like whispers in a tomb. The stairs spiraled so tightly that each turn seemed to fold the earth over them, sealing them deeper into secrecy. The contrast struck Bauer sharply. Above ground, roses bloomed in their perfumed radiance, celebrated as miracles. Here, beneath the soil that nourished them, the walls were streaked with soot. The stones pitted as though scarred by heat. He could not help but think that every petal above was fed by what these walls had endured. He steadied himself, writing silently in his mind the words he would later commit to his journal. The roots of beauty reach down into filth. Sanctity stands upon a foundation of fire. At last, the stair gave way to a chamber that sprawled wider than he expected. The lantern's glow revealed low arches, their surfaces blackened, and rows of niches carved into the walls. In some, fragments of bone lay unhidden, small and brittle, too fragile to belong to grown men. The air was heavy with dust, and yet beneath it lingered the unmistakable stench of long-cooled char. Marta gasped softly, covering her mouth with her sleeve, while one of the fathers dropped to his knees, his hand trembling as it brushed against a fragment the size of a child's finger. In the chamber's center stood an altar of stone, its surface cracked and scorched. Upon it lay a book bound in leather, its edges warped by heat. Bauer opened it cautiously, the pages stiff and flaking. Inside were records written in the same hand as the coded letters, but here the words were stripped of pretense. No ciphers, no Latin pieties, only raw entries. Age 6 taken from her bed. Burned clean. Roses doubled in bloom. Another line, age 9 unwilling. Ash thick, scent strong. Petals lasting beyond frost. Each entry was a ledger of flesh, noting outcomes not in spiritual terms but in botanical results. The cruelty of it was sharpened by the matter-of-fact tone, as though the author had been tallying bushels of grain instead of lives. Bauer read aloud until his voice faltered, and the silence of his companions carried more weight than any scream. They did not need to speak. The truth had sunk its claws too deeply. Beyond the altar, another discovery awaited. A trough lined with soot and hardened residue suggested that fires had been kept here, deliberately controlled and repeated. Nearby stood racks of tools, tongs, hooks and iron rods, all blackened with use. The fathers recoiled, their faith ruptured by the evidence before their eyes. One struck the wall with his fist, shouting the name of his lost son until his voice broke. Bauer forced himself to keep recording details, though his own stomach churned. He sketched the altar, noted the tools, transcribed passages from the ledger. Evidence would be their only defense when the abbot surely accused them of slander. Yet even as he worked, the weight of despair pressed harder, for he realized that truth alone might not be enough. The abbot's authority, sanctified by years of trust, might still outshine the horrors buried here. As they prepared to leave, Marta noticed something tucked beneath the altar, a bundle wrapped in cloth. With trembling hands she drew it out and unwrapped it. Inside lay a rosary, its beads scorched, its crucifix bent from heat. It was no anonymous relic. She recognized it at once. This was Jakob's, she whispered, her voice breaking. The boy's fate was now undeniable. The lantern flickered, as if the air itself resisted their presence. Bauer urged them upward, each step back toward the surface, a battle against the suffocating knowledge of what they had seen. When at last they emerged into the cool night air of the garden, the roses swayed gently in the breeze, their perfume thick and sweet. The contrast was almost unbearable. Fragrance masking char, beauty concealing atrocity. Bauer looked upon the blossoms and felt no reverence, only revulsion. He knew the deeper chamber had changed everything. This was no longer a matter of suspicion or rumor. They now carried proof, undeniable and damning. And yet, as he glanced toward the chapel where chants still rose in perfect harmony, he understood that exposing this truth would not be simple. The parish would be forced to confront a miracle built on ash, and faith was not easily untangled from deception. The following day dawned with a sky the color of lead, low clouds pressing down on the valley as though the heavens themselves anticipated conflict. The parish gathered in the square, drawn not by bells but by rumor, by whispers that spread from hearth to hearth through the night. Mothers clutched children tighter, men carried tools they pretended were for labor, and the air carried the weight of unspoken dread. Bauer stood among them, his satchel heavy with the proof he and his companions had brought from the hidden chamber. He had rehearsed in his mind the words he might speak, yet now, facing the crowd's restless eyes, those words felt brittle. The abbot arrived with his brothers in procession, their robes immaculate, their faces serene. They carried no weapons, only crosses and candles, as if to cloak themselves in innocence. The abbot raised his hand for silence, and the murmurs stilled. His voice, calm and measured, rang across the square. "Children of God, you have been led astray by men who mistake curiosity for wisdom. They dig where they should pray, and they find shadows where there is only light." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding, others shifting uneasily. It was then that Marta stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "I saw it," she cried. "The bones, the ledger, the rosary of my Jacob." Her words cut through the abbot's authority like a blade. The fathers followed, lifting the scorched cloths and the jar of ash, their hands shaking but resolute. Bauer opened the satchel and raised the warped ledger high, its pages brittle but legible. "These are not shadows," he said. "They are records, names of your sons and daughters, offered not to heaven but to fire." The square erupted. Some villagers surged forward, shouting for justice while others recoiled, insisting it was blasphemy to accuse holy men. A woman fainted, clutching her child to her chest. The blacksmith roared that his niece's name was in the book, while another villager spat at Bauer's feet, accusing him of poisoning faith. The abbot lifted his voice above the chaos, serene as ever. "These are lies," he declared. "Lies fashioned by those who cannot understand the mystery of sacrifice. The relics you see are holy remains, preserved by our order for generations. Would you allow an outsider to teach you that your faith is sin?" The contrast sharpened in that instant. Evidence against authority, grief against belief. Bauer opened the ledger to the page he had copied aloud in the chamber, the entry that spoke of a child's ashes, nourishing roses beyond frost. He read it aloud, his voice ringing over the tumult. Gasps rose from the crowd, and one of the fathers shouted, "That was my boy. His name is here." The abbot's mask of serenity flickered, if only for a breath. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Bauer, his voice softer now, almost intimate despite the crowd. "You endanger them all," he said. "Their faith, their hope, their salvation. Do you think they can live with what you show them? Better a beautiful lie than a ruinous truth." But the crowd was no longer unified. Some fell to their knees, sobbing prayers, refusing to believe. Others surged with anger, demanding the abbot be bound, shouting that they would tear down the roses themselves. The brothers encircled their leader, shielding him, their chants rising in desperate harmony against the cries of the villagers. Bauer felt the tide turning not toward resolution, but toward fracture. He had laid the proof bare, yet proof did not unite. It split the parish as surely as an axe splits wood. He knew then that this confrontation would not end in words. It would spill into violence, into fire, unless some greater force intervened. As the square dissolved into chaos, the clouds broke overhead, releasing a cold rain that hissed as it struck the torches. Water and flame fought above them, just as faith and evidence clashed below. Bauer clutched the ledger to his chest, the pages growing damp, knowing that what he held might save the truth, or be destroyed in the storm of belief that now consumed the valley. The storm that broke over the valley seemed almost a reflection of the fury that broke. Within the parish, rain hammered the square, flattening the torches into smoke. But it did nothing to quench the fire in the villagers' hearts. Cries rose in the downpour, some demanding that the monastery be stormed, and its vaults laid bare for all, others clinging to the abbot's robes, begging him to shield them from what they insisted were lies. The brothers tried to lead their superior back toward the cloister, chanting prayers over the roar of the crowd. But the people surged against them in waves. Bauer found himself pressed between factions. The ledger clutched against his chest, its damp pages threatening to dissolve. A hand seized his arm, dragging him toward the tavern side. But another pulled him the opposite way, shouting that the doctor must speak more, must prove beyond doubt. He tore himself free, realizing with grim clarity that he had ceased to be a man in their eyes. He was now a symbol, either of deliverance or of blasphemy. The first stone was thrown not at Bauer, but at the cloister wall. It struck with a hollow thud, followed by another, until a rain of rocks battered the monastery's outer defenses. The grieving fathers, driven by rage, shouted for the vaults to be opened to all, for the truth to be carved into stone, so no denial could smother it. Villagers, their grief hardened into violence, snatched tools meant for harvest and turned them into weapons. The brothers, though unarmed, locked arms across the entrance, their chants rising louder, their faces pale but unyielding. The clash, when it came, was swift and brutal. Villagers surged against monks, fists and tools striking cloth and flesh. A torch, rekindled despite the rain, was hurled into the garden, where it sputtered among the roses before catching on dry kindling hidden beneath the blossoms. Flames licked upward, devouring petals even as rain fought them, and a scream tore through the night. Not from pain, but from the realization that the roses, the supposed proof of God's favor, were burning. Bauer staggered back, watching chaos unfold. The contrast was unbearable. Sacred chants drowned by curses. Roses once praised as holy relics now blackened by fire. Faith turning upon itself in the mud of the square. Marta stood near the flames, her face streaked with rain and ash, crying Jakob's name into the storm, as if calling him out of the smoke. He tried to push forward, shouting for order, but his voice vanished in the din. The ledger slipped from his hands and nearly fell into the mud before he seized it again, clutching it like a lifeline. In that moment he understood the terrible futility of proof. He could present names, bones, and ashes, but belief was not swayed by evidence. It was ignited or extinguished by fear. The abbot, protected by a knot of loyal villagers and monks, raised his crucifix high. His voice, though nearly drowned by the storm, cut through with chilling clarity. You defile God's house. You spit upon his miracle. You condemn yourselves to damnation. His words only fed the frenzy. Some fell to their knees, begging forgiveness, while others roared in defiance, hurling more torches into the garden. The monastery bells rang suddenly, not for prayer but as an alarm, their bronze voices clashing with the thunder. Bauer wrote later in his journal, "The square became a crucible. Faith melted into rage, truth into fire. There was no sanctuary left, only a battlefield where God and ash contended. As flames consumed the roses, the parish itself seemed to split irreparably. Families stood on opposite sides, some defending the monastery, others dragging monks into the mud. The storm washed blood into the earth, mingling with ash and petals. Bauer could do nothing but witness, his heart pounding with the knowledge that the valley's silence had not ended in revelation, but in violence that would stain its soil for generations. The fire that licked across the rose garden drove the crowd forward like a tide. The chants of the brothers faltered as villagers, emboldened by fury and grief, surged toward the monastery doors. A crash echoed through the storm as the heavy oak planks, once blessed with holy oil, were battered with tools and shoulders until their hinges groaned and gave way. The cloister that had for centuries stood as sanctuary now became a battlefield. Bauer was carried with the mob, his boots slipping in mud churned with ash and petals. Inside, the stone corridors smelled of damp incense and mildew, a scent soon overwhelmed by smoke from the burning garden. Torches, hastily relit despite the rain, illuminated the vaulted ceilings and painted saints that seemed to weep in the flickering light. Monks scattered through the passageways, some raising crucifixes as shields, others vanishing into shadows. Their chants were drowned by the cries of villagers demanding to be led to the vaults, to the chamber where Bauer had found the ledger. The abbot, pale but composed, stood at the altar of the chapel. He raised his crucifix again, his voice steady, though the storm outside rattled the stained glass. "You desecrate holy ground," he declared. "These walls have kept you safe for generations. Strike them down and you will strike your own souls." His words swayed some, who hesitated, torn between centuries of reverence and the grief of fresh discovery. But others shouted him down, lifting the ledger that Bauer still clutched as proof, calling for the hidden chamber to be opened for all to see. It was Marta who broke the deadlock. She strode forward, her face streaked with soot, her voice cracking but fierce. "If you have nothing to hide, then open the doors. Show us our children." The mob roared in agreement. The abbot's mask of serenity trembled, and for the first time his gaze faltered. Yet he did not move. Instead, two brothers tried to bar the way to the stairwell that led below. The fathers and laborers surged against them, and in the struggle the monks were thrown aside, their robes torn and trampled. Down the narrow stairwell the villagers poured, Bauer among them, though he dreaded what they would find. The air grew colder, heavy with damp stone and something older, fouler. The walls narrowed, lit by sputtering torches, until they reached the iron-bound door. It bore no holy symbol, only rust and a heavy lock. With a crowbar from the blacksmith's hand, the door gave way. The vault yawned open. Silence fell. Within were shelves of urns neatly labeled, stacked row upon row. Small boxes bound in cloth, each marked with names that some in the crowd recognized instantly. A wail broke the hush as a mother collapsed, her trembling hands lifting a bundle that bore the name of her lost son. Others tore open urns, scattering grey ash that clung to their wet fingers. The ledger had not lied. The chamber was no secret of relics, but a catalogue of lives consumed. At the far wall relics lay arrayed, rosaries, tiny shoes, fragments of cloth, a wooden horse scorched on one side. Evidence not meant for reverence but for concealment. A silence heavier than any chant filled the chamber, punctuated only by sobs and the scrape of urns being pulled down. The abbot appeared in the doorway, his face illuminated by torchlight. He did not flee nor deny. Instead, he spoke in a low, resonant voice. "You have forced open what was never meant for your eyes." These children were not lost. They were offered. Their ashes fed the roses that proved our faith true. Without sacrifice, there is no sanctity. His words chilled the air more than the damp stone. Some screamed at him, others fell to their knees in horror, but none could mistake his conviction. The vault shook as thunder boomed overhead. Rainwater dripped from the ceiling, streaking down the labels on the urns, smudging ink until names blurred into nothing. Bauer clung to the ledger, his mind a storm of revulsion and disbelief. The truth was here, undeniable. Yet what could it mean to those who had chosen silence for so long? The confrontation had reached its peak. The vault lay open, the parish's dead laid bare, the abbot's crimes spoken without shame. The monastery was no longer a sanctuary but a tomb unearthed. And above, the roses burned, their perfume turning to smoke that drifted through shattered windows into the storm. The storm outside had not relented, but within the vault it felt as if the very air had thickened, charged with grief and fury. Mothers clutched urns to their breasts, fathers tore labels from shelves, and others overturned boxes in blind desperation, as though by scattering the remains they could undo the silence of years. The chamber was no longer still. It had become a place of lamentation and rage. Bauer stood against the wall, the ledger pressed to his chest, struggling to breathe through the crush of bodies and the acrid smoke that seeped down the stairwell from the burning garden above. Then the cry went up, "Burn it all!" A villager, his face smeared with mud and tears, shouted that the monastery itself must fall, that no stone should remain to cover such a crime. Others echoed him, their voices breaking into a chant of destruction. But not all agreed. An elderly woman, bent with age but fierce in her gaze, clutched a rosary from the shelves and argued that the relics must be preserved, that without them the truth would be lost, denied again as the abbot would surely wish. Her words struck at the crowd like sparks, dividing them anew. Should they obliterate every trace or keep the ashes as testimony? Above them the clash continued, the sound of blows against stone, of screams and prayers mingled together, seeped into the vault. The abbot, still framed in the doorway, seemed strangely calm. His hands, no longer raised in defense, hung at his sides as though he welcomed the storm. "Destroy the house if you wish," he said, his voice hollow but steady. "The roses will grow again so long as you remain weak. You think fire can erase what God has sanctified?" A father lunged at him then, driven by grief beyond reason. He seized the abbot's robe, dragged him into the chamber, and struck him across the face. The monks who had followed tried to intervene, but the crowd surged forward, overwhelming them. The abbot fell among the urns, which toppled and shattered around him, releasing ash into the wet air until the chamber became a haze of dust and smoke. In that suffocating mist, it was impossible to tell whose ashes clung to whose hands. Bauer felt himself choking, not only from the air but from the weight of decision. To destroy the monastery would be to cleanse the valley with fire, yet it would also mean erasing the only evidence that could stand against denial in years to come. He thought of the ledger, damp, fragile but intact, and realized that he alone might carry the record forward if everything else was lost. His duty shifted in that moment from confrontation to preservation. Above, a terrible crack resounded as part of the cloister roof gave way. Rainwater and fire crashed together, sending sparks cascading down the stairwell. Villagers screamed and fled upward, dragging urns or clutching relics in their arms. Some stayed, smashing shelves to splinters, determined that not a trace of the abbot's vault should endure. The chamber became a chaos of conflicting impulses. Preserve, destroy, weep, avenge. The abbot, bloodied but unbroken, raised his head in the midst of the ruin. His voice, though hoarse, carried with eerie calm. "You cannot unmake what has been sanctified by sacrifice. You may scatter ash to the wind, but it will return to feed the earth. And from earth roses." His words sent shivers through Bauer, not because he believed them, but because he saw that even now some villagers faltered, torn by faith and fear. The vault would not hold much longer. Smoke thickened and the timbers above groaned. Bauer forced his way to the stair, coughing, clutching the ledger tight against his soaked coat. Behind him the chamber dissolved into chaos, ashes rising in spirals, cries of grief and rage echoing off stone, the abbot's voice still steady amidst the collapse. When Bauer emerged into the cloister, the scene was one of ruin. Flames had spread across the garden and licked at the lower walls. Rain hissed but could not douse them entirely. Villagers fought among themselves, some carrying urns away, others setting fire to doors and chambers. The monastery bells had fallen silent, their tongues cracked, their bronze warped by heat. The valley's sanctuary was collapsing under the weight of revelation and fury. Nothing could be undone now. The silence that had once suffocated the parish was gone, but what replaced it was not peace, it was ruin, a void where faith and truth wrestled in the mud and smoke. Years later, the valley lay quiet again, though not with the serene hush of prayer that once defined it. The monastery was gone, reduced to a shell of blackened stone and charred beams. Its cloisters collapsed into heaps of rubble where weeds now grew. The rose garden, once the pride of the parish and the excuse for so much silence, never returned. In its place rose thistles and nettles, stubborn reminders of neglect. Pilgrims no longer came. The road to the village grew over with moss, and maps ceased to mark the place at all. The ruin was allowed to fade into obscurity, as if forgetting could erase the memory of ash. The survivors carried their grief in different ways. Some families buried the urns they had salvaged, marking graves that were more symbolic than certain. Others scattered ashes to the wind, hoping that dispersal might undo the horror of containment. A few, still bound by faith, whispered that the abbot had not been mad, but chosen by God to bear the terrible burden of sacrifice. They prayed in secret, preserving fragments of his words as if they were scripture. These divisions ensured that the parish never fully healed. Instead, it fractured into quiet households, each carrying its own version of truth. The abbot himself vanished in the chaos of that night. Some swore they saw him pulled into the vault as fire consumed it, his voice still echoing as the ceiling fell. Others claimed he walked calmly into the storm and was swallowed by the hills, never to be found. Without a body, he became less man than symbol, either martyr or monster, depending on who told the tale. The ambiguity suited the valley, where silence once again became a defense against unbearable memory. As for Bauer, he left the parish within weeks. His journal records the decision with bitterness. I could not heal them. My presence was no longer welcome, for I had shown them a truth they could not share. I carried the ledger with me, though each page weighs heavier than any book. I have known, he placed the fragile volume in the archives of a university far from the valley, where it was sealed under the care of those who regarded it with more skepticism than reverence. To scholars it was a curiosity, a relic of rural superstition. To Bauer it was a graveyard pressed into paper. The decades that followed layered dust upon the story. Official records listed the monastery's destruction as a fire caused by lightning. Nothing more. The deaths, the vault, the ashes, none of it appeared in parish registers. For outside eyes, the valley's silence was complete, a void written into history. Only whispers remained, passed down in half-remembered tales of roses that once bloomed against winter frost, and of villagers who swore those roses fed on something more than soil. And so the contrast persisted, beauty and horror entwined, sanctity and sin inseparable. The ruins became a symbol, though no one agreed on its meaning. Was it a warning of what faith can conceal? A reminder of the cost of silence? Or merely a story exaggerated by grief, stripped of truth by time? The answer depends perhaps on what one is willing to believe. We telling it now must also reflect there is an ethical burden in reviving such accounts. The victims, whose names smudged away in damp ink, whose ashes scattered into soil, deserve not to be spectacle but remembrance. The monastery's fall is not a story of triumph, nor of divine punishment, but of the terrible ease with which communities trade truth for comfort. Silence may protect the living, but it condemns the dead to oblivion. And so we end where we began, with roses blooming impossibly on a bed of ashes. Ask yourself, if such beauty grew before you, would you pluck it, admire it, carry it home, or would you ask what fed its roots, and risk shattering the silence that keeps communities whole? That question lingers as it must, for silence is never neutral. It is a choice. If you have stayed with this account, consider sharing where you listen from. Each voice that speaks breaks silence anew, and perhaps in that small act, denies the fate that claimed the parish. The ruins remain in their valley unseen, but the story does not have to remain buried. It waits like ash beneath soil for remembrance to stir it into life again.